Welcome back to Dark Horror Stories. In today's episode, I'm sharing 9 deeply unsettling stories from old motels, those roadside places that sit just off forgotten highways, half-lit and quiet in ways that feel wrong. These are accounts from people who checked in looking for a night's rest and found something waiting that had no business being there. Get comfortable, turn the lights up if you need to, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Story 1. There's a stretch of highway in central Nevada that I don't think shows up on most maps anymore, or if it does, nobody's bothered to update the satellite images because the last time I drove it, in the late summer of maybe 2017 or 2018, the roadside was nothing but cracked scrub and old fence posts leaning into the heat. I'd been driving for about 11 hours. I was moving cross-country for a job I ended up not even keeping for a full year, which makes the whole thing feel almost cruelly pointless in retrospect. My name's Petra, and I'm telling this because I've tried to work it out in my head for years, and it doesn't get any cleaner no matter how many times I go over it. I pulled off because the gas gauge was sitting just above the red, and I wasn't sure how far the next town was. I had a road atlas, an actual paper one my dad had given me because he didn't trust GPS in the desert. And it was torn along the spine so pages kept sliding out. I remember my coffee had gone completely cold and tasted like the cardboard sleeve had dissolved into it. I hadn't eaten since a gas station burrito somewhere in Utah that I was already regretting. The motel was called the Sage View, according to a sign that had lost its S somewhere along the way, so it just read Age View in faded orange letters. There were maybe 12 rooms in a long single-story row and a small office with a light on. The parking lot had 2 other cars in it. One of them had a flat tire and a layer of dust that suggested it hadn't moved in some time. The other one looked fine, which I told myself meant other guests, which meant it was safe enough for one night. The man at the desk was somewhere between 50 and 70. I genuinely couldn't place him. And he had a radio playing very quietly, something instrumental and staticky. He charged me cash only and slid a physical key across the counter, an actual metal key on a diamond-shaped orange fob with the number 7 stamped into it. He didn't make small talk. I noticed his left hand had a long scar running from the wrist toward the thumb, and I thought briefly about asking him about it and then didn't. Room 7 smelled like old carpet and something faintly chemical, not quite bleach. There was a painting above the bed of a mountain that didn't look like any range near Nevada. The TV got 4 channels and one of them was just static the whole time, even when the others worked fine. The mattress dipped badly in the center. I remember noticing the curtain rod had been repaired with duct tape at one end. None of this bothered me. I'd stayed in worse. I showered, set an alarm on my phone, and was asleep before 10. I woke up because the room was cold. Not just cool from the AC, cold. The kind that sits inside your chest when you breathe in. I'd left the window unit off because it made a grinding sound, and the room had been stuffy when I fell asleep. The temperature had dropped so far that I could see my breath in the thin orange light coming under the door from the parking lot. I sat up and didn't move for a minute, just kind of cataloged the room to orient myself. The TV was off. My phone said 2:47 a.m. and had 30% battery. I told myself the desert cools fast at night and I'd probably just kicked off my blanket in my sleep. I reached down to pull it back up and realized it was already on me. Then I heard the breathing. It was coming from the narrow gap between the wall and the dresser, which was maybe 18 inches wide. I hadn't looked in that gap when I came in. There was no reason to. It was just shadow and wallpaper and probably years of dust, but something in that dark space was breathing. Slowly. A long inhale, and then a longer exhale. Measured and deliberate, like something that was being very still and very patient. I told myself it was the ventilation, Old motels have weird ducts. I told myself that for about 30 seconds, which is how long it took me to realize the breathing had rhythm but no mechanism. It wasn't air moving through a system. It had weight behind it, the kind of presence you feel in your sternum when someone is standing very close to you. I reached for my phone to use the flashlight. Slowly, trying not to make the bed creak. The breathing stopped the moment my hand touched the phone. The room was so quiet I could hear the highway, distant and low. I sat there in the dark, not moving for what felt like 5 full minutes. Nothing. I turned on the flashlight and pointed it at the gap beside the dresser. The gap was empty. Just dark wallpaper with a water stain shaped like something reaching upward and a dusty floor. I almost convinced myself I'd been half asleep and imagined it. Almost. I got up and moved the dresser away from the wall. Behind it, in the space between the dresser and the plaster, there were handprints, not in dust, in the wall itself. The plaster had been pressed inward at the height of maybe 5 feet, both hands flat, fingers splayed, pushed through the surface like the wall had briefly gone soft. The impressions were deep enough that I could fit my own hand into the one on the left and feel the depth of each individual finger. The size was close to mine, maybe slightly larger, but the fingers were wrong. Too long in the middle, with a strange spacing between the ring and pinky that bent the impression inward instead of out. Whatever had made those was not standing in the gap beside the dresser. It was standing inside the wall. I threw everything I owned back into my bag in under 3 minutes. I didn't check out. I didn't go near the office. I got in my car and drove for 2 hours without stopping, the whole time watching in the rearview mirror, not entirely sure what I expected to see. The cold in the room hasn't fully left me. I mean that. There are mornings, even now, when I breathe in and it's there for just a second, that particular cold with weight in it. And I think about those handprints and try to figure out which side of the wall they were being made from. I've never settled on an answer I can live with. Story 2. My grandfather on my mother's side used to say that some roads were older than their names, and that the land under old asphalt remembers what it was before anyone paved it. I thought that was the kind of thing old men say when they want to sound wise. I was 24 and I drove through the night and I found out he wasn't wrong. This was in East Texas, somewhere between 2 towns I can barely remember the names of. The one had a gas station with a hand-painted mural of a longhorn on the side of it. I'd been visiting my grandmother after she had a fall. She was okay, just shaken and bruised, and I'd stayed longer than I planned because she was nervous about being alone. She lives about 40 minutes outside anything resembling a city, and I work remotely, so I could afford the extra week. I'm Dominic, by the way. I'm 31 now. This was about 6 years ago. I finally left on a Thursday evening because I had a call Friday morning I couldn't miss. Grandma packed me 3 foil-wrapped packets of cornbread that I still hadn't touched by the time the trouble started, and a thermos of coffee that was strong enough to strip paint. I remember the radio in my truck had developed a habit of switching to AM stations on its own, which had been annoying for 2 days and suddenly felt less like a quirk and more like a sign. I didn't intend to stop at the motel. I'd planned to drive straight through. But somewhere around 11 at night, the truck started pulling slightly left. Just a faint, persistent drift, and I got paranoid about a slow leak on the front tire. I pulled into the gravel lot of a motel called the Pinecrest, which had no discernible pines anywhere near it and no crest of anything. Just a flat, low building sitting back from the road behind a stand of live oak that blocked most of the highway noise. 12 units, exterior access, an ice machine at the far end that hummed loud enough to hear from the car. I knocked on the office door because the sign said closed, but there was a light on. A woman answered, heavyset, maybe late 50s, wearing a housecoat and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. She said the rate was $60 and I could park right outside my door. She seemed completely normal. She had a small TV on behind her playing a home renovation show. I paid cash because I never carry much cash, and $60 was just about everything I had on me, which, now that I think about it, was also a little strange because I usually keep more than that. Room 4, it was clean, which surprised me. No smell beyond a faint floral air freshener. The shower worked. The bed was firmer than I expected. I checked the tire and it looked fine, pressure seemed okay, couldn't see anything obvious. I decided I'd drive in the morning and check properly in daylight. I called my girlfriend, talked for maybe 20 minutes about nothing in particular. She'd had a difficult meeting. I'd had 3 pieces of cornbread and fell asleep with my boots still on, which I used to do all the time back then. The knocking started around 3, not at my door, at the wall that connected my room to room 3. 3 slow knocks, then a pause, then 3 more. Exactly the same rhythm both times. I lay there and listened, and it stopped. I figured it was a guest, maybe drunk, knocking on the wrong wall by accident. I went back to sleep. It started again at what my phone said was 4:11. Same pattern, 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks. I sat up and turned on the lamp. The knocking stopped. I sat there for a full minute in the yellow lamplight and then went to the wall and knocked back. 1 sharp knock, the way you'd knock to tell someone you heard them. Silence. Then the knocking came from the ceiling. 3 slow knocks directly above the headboard. Pause. 3 more. The ceiling was low and flat. There was no attic space in a single-story building this old, just roof, insulation if they were lucky, and whatever lived in the dark between. I told myself mice, raccoons, some animal that had gotten into the roof cavity and was moving in a regular pattern somehow. I was aware, even at the time, that this was not a convincing explanation. I moved to the chair by the window and sat with the lamp on. I didn't sleep again. At around 5:30, just as the sky outside was beginning to go gray, I heard the door to room 3 open. I looked through the gap in my curtain. A man came out, or something wearing the shape of a man. He was barefoot on the gravel, which shouldn't have registered as strange at first, except that I could hear it. Each footstep on the gravel was perfectly silent. He was wearing a gray t-shirt and dark pants, and he walked toward the tree line with his hands loose at his sides. His gait was normal. Everything was normal until he was about 15 feet from the trees and he stopped and turned to look back at the motel. He looked directly at my window. I was watching through the curtain with the light on behind me. He should have seen that, or at least the light. He stood there and looked for maybe 8 seconds, and in the growing gray light, I could see enough of his face to understand that it wasn't right. Not wrong in any specific way I can describe easily. Just wrong in the aggregate features that didn't sum correctly, like a face assembled from memory by something that had studied faces but never worn one. Then he turned back toward the trees and walked into them and was gone. I sat there for about an hour. The ice machine hummed. The sky got fully light. Before I left, I looked at room 3's door. It was hanging open about 2 inches. I pushed it the rest of the way open because I don't entirely know why. Some stubborn part of me needed to see. The room was empty and had clearly not been occupied. The bed was stripped. There was no furniture beyond the frame and a dresser with no drawers. The carpet near the wall adjacent to my room had been worn down in a specific pattern, a strip about 2 feet long directly against the shared wall, like something had stood there, shifting weight from foot to foot for a very long time. I left without checking out. I drove to the nearest town, got the tire looked at by a mechanic who said there was nothing wrong with it, and ate breakfast at a diner that was just opening. I didn't tell anyone what I'd seen for about 3 years. I still can't explain the knocking. The rhythm of it especially, 3 and 3, like it was counting something. Story 3. The summer I turned 32, I inherited my uncle's motel. I know that sounds like the setup to a joke, but there's no punchline. My Uncle Bertrand, and yes, that was really his name, and yes, he hated it, died in March and left me a 12-unit roadside property in the Ozarks because I was apparently the only person in the family willing to deal with paperwork. My aunt had already decided she wanted nothing to do with it. My cousins lived out of state. I was the one who answered the attorney's phone call, and that was enough to make me the owner of the Hillside Motor Lodge. I drove out in May to assess it. My girlfriend Renee came with me because she said it sounded like an adventure and she'd never been to that part of Missouri. She brought a bottle of wine and a notebook she said she'd use to catalog anything worth keeping. We were both treating it like a bit of a lark, which I think about now with something close to embarrassment. The motel sat at the end of a gravel road about 6 miles off the main highway. I'd been there twice as a kid and remembered it as charming in a run-down way, the kind of place with a neon sign and a little office with a cowbell on the door. It still had the cowbell. The neon sign was dark. The parking lot had buckled in several places from tree roots, and the units themselves ranged from merely dated to structurally questionable. 3 of them had locked doors that neither my uncle's key nor the master key I'd been given would open. I wrote that down to deal with later. Renee found a box of guest registers in the office closet, going back to the late 1950s. She thought they were charming and sat at the desk reading through old entries while I walked the property with a flashlight and a legal pad. I noted a cracked foundation wall in Unit 9, several window frames swollen shut in Units 5 and 6, and a smell in Unit 11 that I couldn't immediately identify. Not decay exactly. More like wet limestone and something older beneath it. We stayed in Unit 2, which was the cleanest. There was a quilt on the bed that I recognized from childhood visits, which was both comforting and deeply melancholy. Renee opened the wine. We ate sandwiches we'd brought from the last town. We talked about whether the property was worth renovating or worth selling as is, and whether we were really the kind of people who would move to the Ozarks, and whether that was something we even wanted. I fell asleep around midnight. I don't think I dreamed. I woke up because Renee was sitting up in bed and she had her hand on my arm and she was squeezing it the way she does when she wants me to pay attention to something without making noise. I listened. Someone was walking on the roof. Not an animal. The footsteps were too deliberate, too evenly spaced, too human in their rhythm. 1 step, 2, 3. They moved from the far end of the unit's roof toward the front, then stopped. Then slowly came back. I told myself it was possible. Old flat-roof motel, something large enough, a person even maybe trespassing or using the roof to access something. I told myself all of this and didn't believe any of it, but it was the scaffolding of rationality I needed to not immediately lose my composure. Then the footsteps went off the edge of the roof at the front of the unit and continued. On the wall, moving downward, each step the weight of a person, crossing the exterior wall of the unit and descending toward the ground. We heard them reach the pavement of the parking lot. We heard them cross the lot toward the tree line, that same deliberate, unhurried pace. And then we heard nothing. Neither of us moved for a long time. In the morning, I went out and looked at the front of the unit. The stucco on the exterior wall from the roofline down to the parking lot had a series of impressions in it, divots slightly larger than my fist at intervals of roughly 2 feet, forming a diagonal line from the roofline to the ground. Each one was perfectly round and went in about 1 inch. Whatever had made them, the stucco had offered no resistance. Renee photographed them. The photographs exist. I've looked at them many times. We didn't go back. I worked out the estate sale and the property transfer by phone and through the attorney. I have no idea who bought it. I didn't ask. There were 3 locked units I never opened, and now I'm grateful for that. I've had a long time to think about what was up there, moving from unit to unit across those locked roofs, and why it came down the front wall so slowly, so carefully, like it wanted to make sure we heard every single step. I still have the quilt from the bed in Unit 2. I don't know why I took it. Some nights I wish I hadn't. Story 4. There's an old highway through central Oregon that used to see a lot of truck traffic before the interstate was finished, and there's a stretch of it near a town called Delwood. Though I've been unable to find Delwood on any current map, which I find I'm able to worry about less than I used to, but still, where the road runs alongside a dry riverbed for about 9 miles. When I drove that road in 2019, I stopped at a motel called the Riverbend on account of I'd had 3 hours of sleep in 2 days and had started seeing motion in my peripheral vision that wasn't there. My name is Tommy Chen, and I'd been documenting abandoned agricultural sites for a project that was never going to be published anywhere, and I knew it, but it gave me a reason to drive, and driving was the one thing that cleared my head in those years. I was 29. I had a camera bag, a cooler with 3 warm sodas and some jerky, and a habit of stopping at whatever lodging appeared first when the tiredness hit. The Riverbend had 9 units and an office that shared a wall with Unit 1. I checked in around 7 in the evening, and the clerk was a teenage boy who barely looked up from his phone. He took my card, handed me a paper sleeve with a key card in it, and went back to whatever he was watching. The parking lot had one other car, an old sedan with a bumper sticker I couldn't read. The vending machine in the breezeway sold chips, candy, and a brand of water I didn't recognize. My room smelled fine. The TV was a flat screen, which surprised me given the state of the exterior. The bedspread had a pattern of southwestern geometrics in faded orange and brown. I charged my phone, ate the last of the jerky, showered. The water pressure was excellent, another surprise. I remember thinking the motel was better than its appearance suggested, which in retrospect has layers I don't like to examine too closely. I was asleep by 8:30. At some point in the night, I don't know when, my phone was across the room charging and I hadn't worn a watch in years, I became aware of a sound outside my window. It was a voice. A woman's voice speaking in a low, continuous murmur. The words weren't distinct at first, just tone and rhythm, the way you'd hear someone on a phone call through a wall. I lay there half asleep thinking it was another guest on a late call, or maybe someone in the parking lot. I wasn't frightened. I was just dimly, irritably aware of it. Then it said my name, not in the cadence of a sentence, not, "Oh, Tommy," or "Tommy, listen." Just my name once, clearly and low, with a particular weight on it, the way my mother used to say it when I was a child and had done something she needed to address. The way that lands in your sternum even as an adult. My mother died when I was 25. I was awake completely, instantly, lying absolutely still in the dark listening. The murmuring continued, the same low continuous texture as before, as if the name had been an accident in the flow of something else. I told myself I'd been dreaming. I told myself sound carries strangely in dry country, against stucco walls, along a riverbed with nothing to absorb it. I told myself it was a woman in the parking lot on the phone, and my exhausted brain had shape-fitted my name onto her words. I got up and looked through the curtain. The parking lot was empty. The other car was still there. The vending machine light hummed. The dry riverbed beyond the motel's back fence was a dark cut in the landscape, colorless under a moonless sky. Nothing. I went back to bed and lay there for a long time. The murmuring had stopped. When I finally slept again, I dreamed about my mother, which I almost never do. And in the dream, she was standing at the edge of a dry riverbed with her back to me, and I kept calling her name, and she kept not turning around, and eventually I stopped calling because I understood, the way you sometimes understand things in dreams, that turning around was the one thing I should not be hoping for. I left before sunrise without eating. I didn't want to be there when the light came up. 2 weeks later, going through my camera roll, I found a photograph I didn't remember taking. It was timestamped 3:09 a.m. the night I stayed at the Riverbend. It showed the interior of my room dark, lit only by the faint glow coming around the curtain, and in the frame was my own arm stretched out on the bed, and beyond my arm the window, and beyond the curtain's edge, in the narrow gap where it didn't quite close, something standing in the parking lot. I can't make out a face. It's the wrong shape for a person, even in silhouette. Too wide in the shoulders, too narrow below, the proportions all running wrong. But one detail is clear even at that resolution. One hand raised, palm flat, pressed lightly against the outside of the glass. I don't know when I took the photo. I don't know if I took it. I still have it. I don't look at it often. Story 5. Growing up in coastal Georgia, you develop a particular relationship with humidity, not just as weather but as presence, the way the air wraps around you and sits on your skin like it's listening. I mention this because when I say the motel felt wrong from the moment I stepped out of my car, I want you to understand that I mean it the way someone from that climate means it. Not just a chill, a wet, living wrongness that the body registers before the mind does. I'm Lila Fontaine. I was 36 and doing field work for a marine conservation nonprofit, and I'd been assigned to monitor nesting sites along the coast for 3 weeks. My usual lodging had a plumbing failure the second week, so the organization's coordinator booked me into a place called the Atlantic Tide Motel, which sat about 2 miles from the water and hadn't seen any tidal action since, I estimated, roughly 1987. The building was long and white and peeling, with dark green shutters on every unit that were nailed shut on about half of them. The sign had a painted wave on it that had faded to a pink smear. The parking lot was crushed oyster shell, which crunched under my tires and sent up a fine white dust. I had my field kit, a cooler, 2 changes of clothes, and a profound hope that the Wi-Fi would work. The office smelled like incense and old paper. The woman at the desk was small, maybe 70, with silver hair cut close and a silver ring on every finger. I counted 8 rings, which was 1 more ring than fingers on the hand I could see. She gave me the key to Unit 6, a physical brass key with a starfish-shaped fob, and told me not to use the parking space at the far end of the lot, the one closest to the tree line. When I asked why, she said it had drainage issues and didn't offer more. Unit 6 was fine. Salt smell, faded nautical prints on the walls, a ceiling fan that wobbled slightly but worked. The Wi-Fi password was written on a card next to the lamp in letters so small I had to use my phone camera to read it. I showered off the field smell, ate leftover rice I'd brought in the cooler, and sat outside my door in the salt air for a while because it was a beautiful evening and I'd learned not to waste those. Across the lot, the parking space the woman had warned me about was empty and looked completely ordinary. I noticed the tree line behind it was denser than everywhere else along the property's edge. The trees came right up to the fence there, and the fence had a gate that looked like it hadn't opened in years. The padlock on the gate was new. Everything else was rusted, but the padlock was bright and clean. I noticed this and filed it and went inside. At around 2 in the morning, I heard something at the fence. Not a sound I can easily describe. Not scratching, not banging. More like pressure against the chain link, a sustained push and release, like something working methodically at the connection points, testing them. I lay in bed and listened and told myself it was the wind, even though the night was completely calm, the curtains hanging perfectly still at the half-open window. Then I heard it inhale. Something right against the fence, that close, breathed in slowly. And what I remember most clearly, because my brain latches onto specific details when it's frightened and won't let go, is that it sounded like something breathing in the smell of the lot. Tasting the air, locating something. I did not open the curtain. I want to be clear about that. I did not look. I sat up in the bed with my back against the headboard and I watched the curtains and I waited. And what I heard over the next 20 minutes was a systematic movement, that push and release on the fence, moving along its length, reaching the gate, pausing at the gate for a long time, too long, and then moving along the fence in the other direction, following the tree line until it was too far away to hear. In the morning, the gate padlock was still locked. but the fence around it had pulled away from its posts on both sides in a way that left a gap about 8 inches wide. Something had pushed the fence inward from the exterior. The posts were bent toward the lot, the chain links stretched and deformed. The gap was too narrow for a person. The bent posts were thick galvanized steel. I reported it to the woman in the office. She looked at it for a moment and then said very quietly that she would have someone fix it. She didn't seem surprised. I asked her what was in the trees. She looked at me with the patience of someone who has answered this question many times and reached the same conclusion about the value of answering it. She said, "Nothing that wants to be in there, honey. That's the whole problem." I stayed one more night because my alternative was a 2-hour drive and I had a 5 a.m. survey. The second night was silent. I left before sunrise and I drove past the fence and the gap was gone, fixed overnight with new chain links so bright it looked surgical, and the tree line beyond it was perfectly still in the gray morning light. I've thought about what she said. I think about it differently depending on how I'm feeling. Some days it almost makes sense. Most days it doesn't. Story 6. I want to start by saying I'm not someone who believes in this kind of thing. I mean, I didn't used to be. I have a degree in electrical engineering. I solve problems with diagrams and I trust what I can measure. I'm telling you this not to establish credibility, but because the person I was before that September would have listened to this story and said the words sleep deprivation or auditory pareidolia and moved on. I want you to understand what it costs me to say that none of those explanations work. My name is Marcus Osa, and I was on a contract job running electrical assessment on a cluster of small commercial properties in northern Idaho, which in September has weather that can't decide between autumn and winter and lands somewhere around Cruel. The crew was me and 2 other contractors, a plumber named Vicky Strand and a structural assessor named Ray Almos, and we'd been at it for 2 weeks. That night we were staying at a place called the Ponderosa Rest, which was 3 miles from anything and had a generator humming constantly behind the building because the main grid connection was, according to our host, unreliable. The host was a man named, I think, Arthur, though I only ever saw him the first and last times I was there, and both times he seemed to be in a different state than the one the motel was in, emotionally speaking. He had a daughter who ran the desk most mornings, a girl of maybe 17 with braces, and a collection of ceramic horses arranged on the counter that she was clearly protective of. I remember she had a homework sheet she kept working on between check-ins. Algebra. I remember thinking the problems weren't that hard. The 3 of us were in adjacent rooms. Vicky was in 8, I was in 9, Ray was in 10. We'd had dinner at the only restaurant within driving distance, a bar and grill that served exactly 4 things and came back around 9. I remember Ray was grumbling about his assessment tools. Something was off with his measurements in one of the buildings. And Vicky was reading a mystery novel she said was terrible but couldn't put down. I read for maybe half an hour and was asleep before 10:30. I woke up at some point to the sound of the generator cutting out. The sudden silence was complete and loud in its own way, the way a sound that's been there long enough becomes part of the room and its absence is its own noise. My room went from dark to absolute dark. I lay there waiting for the generator to kick back on. It didn't. After a few minutes I heard Ray's door open and close and then Vicky's. I figured they'd noticed too and were probably checking what was going on. I got my boots on and went out. Vicky was in the breezeway with a flashlight. Ray was not there. I said, "Where's Ray?" and she said she thought he'd knocked on her door and then went back to his room. I hadn't seen him come back. We knocked on his door, nothing. She knocked harder, nothing. I tried the door. Motel doors could be tricky. Sometimes the lock didn't catch and it swung inward. Ray's room was empty. The bed was slept in but empty. His shoes were there. His phone was on the bedside table, screen lit with a notification. The window was open about 6 inches, the curtain drifting. We weren't especially alarmed yet. He might have stepped out, might be at the far end of the building, might have gone to check the generator. Vicky went toward the back of the property where the generator was. I walked the length of the building, calling his name quietly so as not to wake the other guests. I found him sitting on the ground between units 4 and 5, in the narrow gap between the buildings, his back against one wall and his knees drawn up. He was staring at the space between his feet. He didn't respond when I said his name the first 3 times. When he finally looked up, he looked at me the way someone looks at you when they've forgotten you exist. A genuine, effortful process of recognition, like coming up from a great depth. He said, "Did you see it come out of 5? Unit 5 was locked. It had been locked since we arrived. Arthur had said the room had a maintenance issue, nothing to do with us." I said no. He said it had been standing in the gap right where he was sitting, and it had gone into the wall of Unit 5, through the wall, and then the generator had come back on and the light had come back and it was just a wall. Ray was the least fanciful person I'd ever met. He assessed structural integrity for a living. He trusted measurements. He didn't describe what he'd seen in detail. He said he didn't want to. The only thing he said was, its arms were the wrong length. Everything else I could have rationalized, not the arms. The generator was running fine when we checked it. There was no reason it should have cut out. In the morning, we found that the moisture sensor in Ray's room had been triggered during the night. It was a unit we'd installed ourselves as part of the assessment, calibrated that day. The log showed a spike around 2:40 a.m., a sustained period of elevated humidity inside the room, far above ambient, and then a return to normal at 2:59, 19 minutes. Ray had been outside for approximately 19 minutes. He said he didn't know how long he'd been out there. He said it felt like 2 minutes. He finished the contract, and I haven't worked with him since, not because anything happened between us, but because he left the profession and moved to a town near his parents in New Mexico, and the last time we spoke, he told me he'd been sleeping with the lights on. I think about those 19 minutes more than I think about anything else from that job, more than what he might have seen. The moisture spike in the empty room. Whatever it was had been in there before it came out into the gap. And something about that, the waiting, the readiness of it, is worse than any description he could have given me. Story 7. My grandmother always said that the land in this part of New Mexico carries memory the way water carries salt. You can't see it, but you can taste it. She lived her whole life in the same county, and she said it the way people say things that are simply true rather than interesting. I was 27 and arrogant, and I thought it was poetic language for limited experience. I'm 35 now, and I think she was being literal. I'm Valentina Reyes, and I was driving back from a photography workshop in Santa Fe, which sounds a lot more glamorous than it was. It was 3 days in a conference room followed by a barely organized critique session where everyone was too polite to say useful things. I was tired and vaguely disappointed, and I'd been talking to my friend Cowan on the phone for the first hour of the drive until my signal dropped somewhere in the hills. I was supposed to make it home in one drive, but it was already almost 10 and the road was winding, and I kept having moments where my eyes unfocused, and I caught myself before anything bad happened. The motel was called La Parada, the stop, or more loosely, the pause, and it sat in a small flat area off the road that had clearly once been more populated. There was a post office box with no post office attached to it standing in the weeds next to the parking lot. There was a diner-shaped building across the road with no lights and plywood in its windows. La Parada had 7 units and a small office where a man with a substantial gray beard was watching a soccer match on a small TV. He was eating something from a bowl and gestured toward the key rack without looking up from the game. Unit 3, $20, which I was about to say seemed like not enough money before I saw the state of the unit and recalibrated. The room had a large crack in the plaster that had been painted over many times and was still clearly a crack. The carpet was the deep terracotta color that was probably fashionable in 1978. The light fixture over the sink had 2 bulbs and one of them was out. The mattress was fine and I was exhausted, and the door lock felt solid, which is the only thing that mattered. I took a photograph of the cracked wall because I photograph things reflexively, occupational habit, and then I put my camera away and went to sleep. Sometime in the middle of the night, I became aware of a presence in the room. This is hard to describe accurately. I didn't hear a noise or see anything. I simply became aware, in the particular way you sometimes become aware of someone looking at you from across a crowded room, that something in the room was attending to me. Not to the room. To me specifically. I opened my eyes. There was someone sitting in the chair in the corner. The chair was one of those old motel chairs, upholstered in some dark fabric, set at an angle between the dresser and the window. I hadn't sat in it. It had been empty when I came in. Now there was a figure in it, sitting very still. The room was almost completely dark. The gap under the door gave a thin line of orange light from the parking lot lamp. I could make out the chair and the shape in it, the general silhouette of a person, hands resting on the arms of the chair, feet on the floor. It wasn't moving, it wasn't making any sound. It was simply sitting there, head slightly forward, and it was looking at me. I don't know how long I lay there before I reached for my phone. A long time. My hand shook when I turned on the flashlight and pointed it at the chair. The chair was empty. I went through everything. I checked the bathroom, the small closet with no door under the bed behind the curtain. Nothing. The window was locked from inside. The door was locked. The sliding chain was on. I sat in the chair myself because some stubborn part of me needed to displace whatever had been there, and I kept the light on for the rest of the night and watched the room, and nothing else happened. In the morning, before I packed my bag, I opened my camera and found the photograph I'd taken of the cracked wall the night before. It was still there, time-stamped from when I'd taken it. But in the photograph, reflected in the dead bulb of the light fixture above the sink, which was convex enough to show a curved, fisheye view of the room behind me, there was the chair. And in the chair, facing the camera, was a shape I had no memory of seeing when I took the photograph. The shape was seated and still. The proportions were roughly human except for the head, which was slightly too large and slightly too low on the neck, tilted forward at an angle that no relaxed person would maintain. It looked like it had been sitting there when I came in, like it had been waiting to see if I'd notice. I deleted the photograph on the drive home. I've regretted that and been grateful for it in roughly equal measure. Story 8. I've tried to figure out the best way to tell this, and I keep coming back to the same problem. The scariest parts aren't the parts I can describe. The scariest part is what I didn't understand while it was happening, and still don't. My name is Eric Sorenstam, and I'm from western Minnesota, where the land is flat enough to see weather coming from 2 counties over, and there's a particular loneliness to the horizon that I've always found comforting rather than bleak. I was 24 when this happened. I'm 38 now. It's taken me a long time to talk about it, and the fact that I'm doing it at all is probably evidence that I've been carrying it too long. My friend Isabel Varga and I were road tripping through the upper Midwest for no real reason, except we'd both just finished grad school applications and needed to be moving. Isabel drove the first half, I drove the second. We split gas and ate drive-through and had a playlist that was far too heavy on folk music, but we'd agreed on it, so we were committed. This was October, so the fields were harvested and the trees were well past their color peak, and everything was brown and low, and the sky was the particular gray that Minnesota does in autumn like a specialty. We stopped at the Lakewood Motel, which as far as I could tell was nowhere near any lake. It was 10 at night, and we'd been driving for 6 hours, and Isabel had a migraine starting, which meant darkness and quiet were priorities. The motel was old, but the office had a new-looking credit card reader and a manager who was professional and quick. 2 rooms, side by side, rooms 11 and 12 at the far end of the building. Room 12 was mine. It was larger than I expected, a sitting area with a small couch in addition to the bed, and smelled like the kind of wood paneling that was installed in 1969 and has been absorbing the weather ever since. There was a painting of a lake scene above the bed that was competent but cheerless. I noted the ice bucket had a crack in it. The TV remote had been fixed with clear tape along the battery compartment. I ate the last of the granola bars I had in my bag, brushed my teeth, texted my parents that I was stopped for the night, and was asleep by 11. I don't know what time it was when the sound started. Late enough that the road outside was completely quiet. It was coming from beneath the floor, a sound that I initially processed as old pipes. A kind of knocking, rhythmic but not perfectly regular, deep in the structure of the building. I lay there and listened and told myself it was plumbing, that old motels had terrible plumbing. I almost went back to sleep, and then it became recognizable, not as plumbing or mechanical or environmental, as language, patterns that repeated. Short burst, pause, long burst, pause, the same sequences returning at intervals. I sat up and put my ear toward the floor, and I could feel as much as hear it, vibration moving up through the floor, through the bed frame into my body. Something below the floor of my room was communicating in a deliberate, structured pattern. I knocked back, 3 knocks on the floor. There was a pause, maybe 3 seconds, and then the pattern resumed from where it had left off, as if my knock had been a brief interruption, as if it wasn't communicating with me, as if I was simply near it. I knocked on the wall between my room and Isabel's, and she opened her door a minute later, headache forgotten. She crouched with me and listened, and I watched her face go through the same process mine had: dismissal, confusion, recognition, stillness. She whispered, "Is someone under the floor?" I said I didn't know. Neither of us wanted to go to the office at whatever time of night it was, and neither of us wanted to say what we were actually thinking, which was that the spacing of the pattern was too wide for pipes and too regular for animal movement and too persistent for anything with a simple explanation. The pattern went on for, I think, 40 minutes. Then it stopped. Not fading, stopped mid-sequence, as if something had turned it off or been interrupted. Isabel stayed in my room. We sat on the small couch with the light on and waited for morning and talked about things we hadn't talked about in a long time: her family, my family, the years just passed, and what we were afraid of. The sound did not come back. In the morning, I looked at the exterior of the motel and found the access panel for the crawl space. It was on the far end of the building, not near our rooms. It was a square of plywood, maybe 2 feet by 2 feet, set low in the concrete foundation skirt. The plywood had been painted over many times, but recently something had pulled it out and set it aside against the foundation wall. The crawl space opening was dark. We stood there and looked at it. There was no sound from inside, just darkness and the faint smell of soil and something else, organic, not quite rot, more like vegetation that's been too long without light. I did not go in. I want to be clear about that. I did not go in. But I looked, and in the darkness, maybe 4 feet back from the opening, there was a mark on the concrete foundation wall. The same short, long pattern I'd heard during the night, scratched into the concrete repeatedly, overlapping itself, the scratches going all the way through the thin layer of the foundation coating into the concrete itself. Not one session, many sessions, over time, something that had been down there for a long time, sending the same message to nobody, to the floor above, to whatever was up there living its temporary life without knowing. I have no idea what it was trying to say. I've thought about it enough that I can reproduce the pattern from memory, and sometimes late at night, when I can't sleep, I find myself tapping it out on the mattress without realizing I've started. That's the part that stays with me, that I've learned its language without learning what it means. Story 9. I should start by saying the Waverly Inn is still there. I checked last year, on a quiet evening when I'd had enough wine to make looking like a reasonable idea. The satellite image is exactly as I remember it: the long white building, the stand of spruce trees behind it, the gravel road leading in off the state highway. The image is from 3 years ago, which is the same year I stayed there, and I've thought about that timing more than I probably should. My name is Cassidy Morn. I was 29, a landscape photographer, and I was spending 2 weeks in northern Vermont because I had the opportunity to photograph the season change, and I'd been putting off doing this particular project for 3 years. I had a rental car and a chest of camera equipment and a detailed itinerary that I was already ignoring by the second day in favor of whatever looked interesting. This is how I ended up at the Waverly Inn, which was not in my itinerary. It was late afternoon, maybe 5:30, and the light was extraordinary. That sideways October light that photographers make entire careers chasing, warm and angled and catching every color at full saturation. I'd been shooting for 6 hours and the light was fading, and the nearest lodging on my original plan was another 30 miles. The Waverly was right there, its white walls burning orange in the sunset, and the line of spruce behind it was so dark it looked like a stage backdrop. I pulled in because it was beautiful. This detail matters to me. I was there because it was beautiful. The inn had been a motel in a previous life and still carried itself that way. A central building with a small dining area and 10 units arranged in an L shape around a modest parking area. The woman who ran it was named Frances, or at least that's what her name tag said, and she was somewhere in her 60s with reading glasses on a beaded cord and the practiced warmth of someone who'd been hosting travelers for decades. She said it was the last good week before she closed for the winter. I was her only guest. She made me tea without asking whether I wanted it and brought it to the small sitting area off the lobby where I was reviewing my shots on my laptop. She looked at the images over my shoulder and said they were beautiful, meaning it, and pointed out a ridge in one of the shots that she said had a name in the local French dialect that roughly translated to the place that watches. She didn't say this as a warning, just as information. My room was Unit 7, and it was lovely in the way New England country lodgings can be: whitewash and pine floors, and a quilt in a pattern I recognized as locally traditional. The window looked toward the stand of spruce behind the property. I opened it an inch because the air smelled like cold wood and leaf decay in the specific way that I find, even now, genuinely beautiful. I worked on image selection until 10, ate the cheese and crackers Frances had left outside my door on a small wooden board, and fell asleep to the sound of the wind in the spruce. I woke to silence. Total, specific silence. The wind was gone and the trees were still, and there was no sound at all from outside, which I noticed because I'd fallen asleep to sound and the brain catches that absence. I looked at the window. Through the gap where I'd left it open, the spruce trees were visible against the sky, and there was enough ambient light from stars from distance to see their outline. One of the trees was moving, not in wind. The trees on either side were perfectly still. This one, second from the left in the line behind the property, was moving at its crown, not swaying, but shifting, branches moving with a slow, deliberate specificity, the way a tree moves when something large is ascending it. I watched, and something reached the crown of the spruce and paused there, and its silhouette against the sky was wrong in ways I'll try to describe only once. It was too large for what could plausibly climb a spruce. The tree's crown bowed outward with its weight. Its shape was roughly vertical, but the proportions didn't hold too much mass in the upper body, limbs that hung rather than projected, a head that moved in a series of discrete rotations rather than a smooth turn. When it oriented toward the window of my room toward me, it went completely still. I stood back from the window, pressed against the wall, and watched the gap between the curtain and the frame. It was in the tree for a long time, still and attending. I have no memory of what I thought during that time, which is its own strange thing. My memory of that period is physically blank, like a section of tape erased. At some point it was gone. In the morning, the spruce tree's crown was visibly damaged. Branches broken at the upper sections, bark stripped in long parallel lines down the upper trunk, the kind of damage you'd expect from a very large animal that used its full weight to descend quickly. Frances saw it when she brought breakfast out to the small table near the parking lot, and she was quiet for a long moment and then said the word again very softly, not to me, just into the air, like she was logging an entry in something she kept internally. She brought me more tea and we sat together and I watched the tree line, and she didn't answer the question I asked her about the tree, which was the only question I felt like I could ask. She said, "Some guests ask to never come back. Some ask when we open in spring." I drove away that afternoon in flat gray light with a camera full of extraordinary photographs and one night I can't account for and a question I've never known how to finish. Not what was it? I gave up on that one a long time ago. The one I can't let go is why it was so still up in that tree, so patient, what it was waiting for up there in the dark with all that weight looking down at my lit window. Whether it found what it was waiting for, or whether it's still there every night in that same tree looking. I haven't looked at the satellite image again. Some things it's better to leave unresolved. Thanks for spending this time with these stories. If something here got under your skin, and I hope something did, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next collection. Drop a comment below telling me which story unsettled you most, and if you've had your own experience in a place like this, I'd genuinely love to hear it. Share this with a friend who loves a good scare, and until next time when you stop for the night, maybe leave the light on, just in case.